Okay, thank you, Dino. All right, we shall start now. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum and good evening to all who are joining us in another one of our Putra Design Lecture Series to listen to one of the most renowned architects in Malaysia. For everyone's information, this PDLS has been running for the past 5 years, inviting many panels as a platform of sharing knowledge. Now, this talk is also available on FB Live, which is on FRSB UPM. And you could also place your questions in either the comment sections here in the Webex or in FB Live itself. Now, I've prepared some remarks as a very brief introduction to someone that is illustrious with his lifetime achievements, but it definitely did not do justice just trying to mention within this short period of time. But nonetheless, I shall try, okay? But because we have only about 90 minutes with Datuk Sri, who will speak and hopefully to have some question and answer at the end of this session. On behalf of the department and the university, we would like to say thank you to Datuk Sri Lim Chong Kiat for graciously sparing an hour of your time to present your journey, your experience, and encounter during your visits to nearly all the Southeast Asian countries back in the 70s and 80s. As we all know, among his monumental projects such as Komta Complex in Penang, Negeri Sembilan State Mosque, Singapore Conference Hall and Jurong Town Hall have inspired many and set a whole new generation of architects up till today. He has been honoured for his architectural contribution by Malaysian Institute of Architects and Singapore Institute of Architects with their highest award, the Gold Medal, in 1997 and 2015. And now he spends most of his time, listen to this, as a botanist specializing in palms and gingers. And we had the honor to go and visit his property that showcased all this. A Penang born and as the youngest of 8 siblings, Datuk Sri attended Penang Free School. Later, he studied architecture at the University of Manchester, then to Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Boston to obtain his master's in 1957. Now, at that time, he also realized that we were actually poorly taught about our own region and the environment at home. So just like we were taught about British history or the world history. So we know little about Southeast Asian history. Now, because of this, his journey of discovery, of learning the cultures of our own region began. As we want to maximize as much time as we can to listen to him speak, with this note, I give the audience to you, Datuk Sri. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, very clearly.
Does it sound all right? Well, it's something that I'm happy to share particularly because Zaki, who's your head of department, is the one who knew me from way back, and also now he seems to be very interested in this work that we've been doing, which is actually causing me to time travel to what I was working on a long time ago. But I'll try to share because I think it's certainly important that UPM comes into the picture. And in the abstract, we mentioned the fact that UPM was interested in the collection that I have, which is a rather huge photo documentation of the folk architecture of Southeast Asia. So I'm going to indulge in telling you the whole background by means of a number of slides. Yeah, I notice that you have quite an audience turning up. I hope there are no intimidating people around, except maybe Robert Powell. But anyway, I'm also used to lecturing to very small groups. In fact, one of the best lectures I gave was only to 4 people. And later, I also lectured in Taiwan many years ago in the 90s to the people in Taiwan, to Cheng Kung University, particularly on this kind of subject. But it's sometime since I revisited this, and I'll share with you. Let's go through the, okay. Now, the abstract tells you the background and that I directed a program, a very important program called CCURP at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore. And later you have more details how this came about. And we were about to do a traveling expedition. We did many traveling expeditions and we wanted to do a publication, which was not fulfilled. But I really hope the expression of interest by UPM will lead to a new publication that will certainly record what we did. And I hope we have time to talk about the important subject of cultural erosion, because a lot of people talk about conservation, and many people are only interested superficially, sometimes to borrow motifs for the resort hotel, no real understanding of the cultural background. And I think it's particularly important for students and architectural students in particular to be well acquainted with ethnography, which is the study of all the cultures of the region. By background, you can see that I was fortunate to be quite well exposed. And as the moderator mentioned, that I'm currently actually much more involved with botany. Now, let's start off by getting you to read the impact words here. Challenges for ethnographic research. When you do anything, you must do it thoroughly, not just look at the superficial pretty pictures and copy. You want to know the whole cultural background, and in the process, understanding your own cultural background in your own country and your own region. So you must have a knowledge of geography, history, and I wonder whether it's taught in school today, but we're going to take you on a whirlwind tour of the region, and you can test your geography without referring to Wikipedia, see whether you know, and ask why you did not know. Indigenous cultures and traditions. Are we being attacked by some background noise? Conservation and restoration is supposed to be an activity, but you must know why you're conserving and why you're restoring, not just for tourism. That is the least of the problems. It is actually the maintaining of a tradition of your society. Then there's a question of relevant modernization as unthinking modernization, just copycat of what is happening elsewhere. And as architects and planners, you have to be concerned about human settlements and their viable future. The region. Now, this is Southeast Asia, and we won't go to the definition, but I'll come to that later. So they can see what we're going to travel around. Now, what we're covering is actually architecture without architects. And this I will mention was a book written by Rudovsky, who was one of my lecturers in MIT. And he started actually to show that there are many things that we know that is integral in the built form that doesn't need to be dependent on attending schools of architecture. Then we have to study the whole, in a sense, ethnographic background, the changes from tribalism, feudalism, modernization, globalization, and then I'm going to introduce what we devised many years ago, what I call the Cultural Erosion Index. How far gone are the cultures? And later we're going to talk even about the Malay houses in our own country. Now, I also did a quote here, the impact of urbanization on man's environment, which is currently the subject in Glasgow and other places, but there actually is a failure in socio-economic development. And then we have the problem of external exploitation, exogenous people from outside exploiting local areas, and a failure in endogenous local planning initiatives and community initiatives. So if you do not have the ability to solve your own planning problems, you need experts from outside. You've already lost half the battle. Now, the whole background of the thrust of the work, and we have to remember a lady called Dorothy Peltzer, who I think was an MIT graduate, and she contacted me while she was researching in the period 62 to 1970, self-funded. But she had a grant from the JDR Third Fund, a small grant, but she died in 72. And you will see that later how it was passed on to me, because in her legacy, she asked the Asian Cultural Council to get me to continue her work. Now, she, in her travels, which will show the book that she wrote, had amassed 15,500 black and white photos with negatives, 7,000 slides, research notes, and manuscripts, all which were originally curated in our program at ISEAS in 1979 to 81, but the original are now with the Smithsonian Institute in Washington. And I've just contacted my good friend Paul Taylor, who's the curator of anthropology, to give us an idea what they're curating there. But the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies also have copies, and so do I. And therefore, it is quite relevant that UPM comes in to help in taking over this archives. Now, this is a background. We actually published this book of her work in 82, and you can see from this background, if you have time to read it, how I got involved. We actually hunted for material in many places, including Cameron Highlands and New York and Cambridge, Massachusetts. We collated the material, brought all of them to Singapore, collated them and set up this program. And then as a result of a Toyota grant, I was acting honorary director, no pay, just as a labor of love, because it so happens that I was covering the same material. And when Dorothy first contacted me, she actually benefited from material that I passed on to her. So anyway, this book is a rare thing and maybe we should republish it because I think it's worth reading. So this is the beginning of that program that we call CCURP, Documentation of Traditional Architecture and Built Form. Now we are actually not going to deal with monuments, but essentially more folk-type buildings, vernacular buildings, and also boats, which are built forms, and certain other type of built structures. And this was a grant under Toyota Foundation, which I directed. And I was the honorary project director. We had two very important collaborators, Ms. Ong Chu Swat, Ong Eng Hai, and these two were really doing sterling work. Ms. Ong, unfortunately, has not been very well, but we will remember her great contribution to this work. Chanda Lim from Indonesia was the bibliographer rather, and many of the other staff from my own office. And there's a Roxana Watterson, whom we imported from Cambridge, who later took up some of the material. Robi Sulato, a very dedicated architect in Bali, was an expert in that area. My own photographic collection at ISES is over 2,000 images, but there's a lot more stashed away. And when the UPM team, with Dr. Wan coming here, you will see that you may probably uncover at least 100,000 images, which hopefully can be curated and shared. And if UPM collects this, it will have the best collection around in the country, probably better than the Museum Negara, which hopefully should support the program and the initiative of UPM. Now, this is actually from what we published, put out before, and you can see what we covered. Now, to tease the audience and the students, you may not be able to read the words very well, but can you read and identify where these images come from? The one on the top is from Philippines, from Ifugawa. These two happen to be photographs of mine. The other one is, we also worked in Sarawak, a Bidayu head house. And actually none left of this condition, although they tried to rebuild some for touristic purposes. Nothing as special as the authentic. Now, this was the area covered, which actually included mainland Southeast Asia. But for our development project, I think we're going to concentrate on archipelago Southeast Asia, leaving out the mainland one for further work. Although I did add on material from the Yami people in Lantau Island of Taiwan, which was also very interesting because it represents a chain of tribal cultures that goes right down to Philippines to Sarawak. You can see very interesting similarities in their traditions, including head hunting, which of course disappeared. Now, this is a key of what we covered. You can see 86 culture groups. We call them culture groups because you will go to look at the Malaysian ones. We actually classified them by states rather than cultures. So we have Johor, Malacca, Negri, and so on. And we will show you some examples of that. So we're going to leave out the blue ones from the current study, although hopefully with more energies, we can extend them to cover everything as well. So here is your test, whether you can know all these areas and know where they are in your geography. Now here's some more pictures from that catalogue. Of course, you should know the Bauhaus from Negeri Sembilan that I think has been restored. And then you have got the one from the Nagaland and this wonderful one from Nias. I suppose everybody knows where Nias is, as against Nia Caves in Sarawak. But Nia, any hands up? We'll quiz them later. So we actually did exhibitions. We did a major one in KL, which was actually opened by Najib. And then this big one came to Penang. And this was, you can see, way back in 1809. So we were sharing this information, but it would seem that not many people took up the interest. So, but however, it's not too late now. So we're going to cover the area which actually should be called Malaysia, which is actually used for botanical purposes. Then we study the flora, we call it Flora Malaysiana, which includes not only Malaysia, but the region including Indonesia and Philippines. But we stopped short at Irian or Papua New Guinea, and of course we leave out Australia. We were going to publish this book, and we in fact announced it, a bit ashamed because we never published it. So in fact, originally the UPM group thought that we could just take this up, but I think we're going to recast it, more focus on subsequent work, and we will derive from this and maybe use a lot of these images in the appendix. So you can see that there were a lot of contributions. Part of the reason we did not continue is because I got diverted to doing history and botany, and I was publishing elsewhere. But I actually continued my interest because I continued to travel, and even as recently as 2 years ago, I revisited many of these places. This is my memo, how it all started. Now, it's important that particularly architecture students should take the initiative to learn more than what they are dished out in the courses. And in my case, at the University of Manchester, I think there's some spelling mistake there, I realized that I wasn't going to be just learning about Greek and Roman and Egyptian architecture. So already when I was there, I decided to learn more about the architecture of our own country. Unfortunately, my father was able to send me photographs. And in fact, in my third year, I did a short thesis on the kampong houses. I also used my time in UK to go to the Natural History Museum, meet people who were interested in the subject. So later at MIT, when I had a Harkness Fellowship, I also took time off, firstly inspired by Bernard Rosowski, the author of the book Architecture Without Architects, and many other inspiring people. So simultaneously, people think it's a distaff thing. Why we are studying modern architecture, we should also be involved with folk. The whole thing is interrelated. The whole effort by human beings is what we are studying. So at MIT, whilst I was actually meeting and working with people like Gropius, and I actually met Frank Lloyd Wright and other people, all the famous architects, Rudolsky were good friends. I took time off in Yale and locked myself in the Sterling Library for 2 weeks under the influence of Karl Peltzer, who was a professor of geography of Southeast Asia, and Harold Conklin was an expert on Philippines. And then I met Rosa Covarrubias from Mexico, who inducted me into Bali, the history of Bali. Back to Singapore, I had contact with people at Gibson Hill, who was the curator of the Singapore Museum, and at Polymath Ivan Polunin. And then back in UK, Paul Oliver in Oxford Brookes, Rappaport, all those people were also studying folk architecture, and you can find their publications. And then there was a wonderful researcher called Dominic Gaudens in Switzerland, who studied particularly the Karo Batak with wonderful drawings. And I also went to the Leiden Folk Museum. And we can see that in the West, they have so much more material that's not available here. So anybody researching further should get a grant to really find all that material. But before you do that, you can come and help yourself to my collection. When I set up the School of Architecture in the Singapore Polytechnic in 1958, I made it a point to get the students to go all over Malacca. We had a whole trip to Malacca, and I'll talk about that later. On my own, I began to travel, not only within Peninsular Malaysia, getting to almost every part of the country, which I repeated later when I did botany. Sarawak, Sabah, Thailand, Philippines, Bali, Lombok, Sumatra, Java, Sulawesi, Flores, Sumba, and Taiwan from 1960s to even as recently as 2 years ago. Dorothy Peltzer's legacy went on from 71 to 80, and under the Asian Cultural Council, Smithsonian contacted me. I used to go to Smithsonian to work with them and also to learn about their other collections. Institute of Southeast Asian Studies take a lot of credit for actually stimulating and curating this work. And thanks to Toyota Foundation, I also was in Japan to look at the Kyoto Museum of Ethnography, which has a wonderful collection with life-size models of houses and so on in this area. I hope you will note this because try not to reuse images without permission, because some of the images are not mine. So later when UPM curates them, you can probably have access for research purposes. Okay, let's do a lightning tour. How much time do I have, by the way, moderator? What time is it now? How many minutes have gone by? Okay, anyway, you have to tell me if I'm too slow. Okay, identification. Everyone should know the origin of the Seremban Minangkabau. Its origin is in Padang, the Minangkabau, the great museum in Padang at Bukit Tinggi. And I visited this many times, so this was a fairly recent picture taken, very well preserved. And I must say, in Indonesia, the effort to conserve is really very, very commendable. We don't want to make invidious comparison with what's happening in Malaysia, but certainly you can learn a lot. I also covered the Karo Batam area. You can see the decline. This is what we're talking about, cultural erosion. Why is it the occupants no longer maintain their houses? Is there a parallel with the Malay kampung today? The other encroachment is the new buildings built down, so there's no planning control. The community is overpopulating and losing their sense of community. But at that time, when I went there, there were still these wonderful houses, the Karo Batak. You must know there are two types of Batak, the Toba Batak and the Karo Batak, near the Lake Toba, with the island called Samosir in the middle. Samosir is not the thing you eat, but the name of the island, which I used to embarrass the Singaporeans by telling them that Samosir is bigger than Singapore in a lake in Sumatra, and not only bigger, but thicker, much taller with mountains and so on. So Singaporeans should learn how small Singapore is by going to Samosir. I collected models, by the way. This is one, I don't know, people ask me, how did I get it back? Well, when there's a will, there's a way. I still have this, and maybe you can look at it. Now, studies were made by other people, notably by Lai Chi Ken of Singapore and US, and he brought students to measure. This one is the Toba Batak house. And they went to a place which I'm sad to say I never got the chance to go to, which is in Nias. So here are pictures taken by them. But there's a lot of ethnographic material done by the Dutch, and we can study them. And today, of course, they're still keeping this alive for tourism mainly, but certainly I would like to still go there, although time is too late. The last time I tried a few years ago, the tsunami hit that area, so I wasn't going to get caught, so I came home. A look at how it is related. The genesis of tradition may be due to boat forms and so on. You can study that. But let's celebrate the fact that they're still able to build this. You can see the north and south forms are different. And that's a relationship throughout the whole. Where did it origin? Which tribal areas spread to other areas? This is all part of history. These are also wonderful drawings. And I mentioned Dominic Gaudens from Switzerland, who also did very good drawings, and it's all available in publications. Am I going too fast, or should I? Can you hear me at all, moderator?
Yes,
okay,
I can
so
hear you clearly. Please proceed.
So far, not too boring. Not boring. So I carry on. Sorry, you're all captive, so you don't ever say.
Definitely not boring
this.
at all.
Okay, identify this. Anybody? I was surprised because I have a lot more photographs, which is in the ISAS collection, that I went to this area, which is in North Luzon, to a place called Baguio. And there were two tribal groups, the Igorot and the Ifugawa. And they are very interesting parallel with the Kenya and Kayan of Sarawak. So you can see the connection later we study it. This is the Ifugawa village called Ma Yao Yao. And to get there, I have to boast, I actually had to traffic with the dissidents, the Moro Liberation Army, to give me a pass to go through without government knowing that I slipped into this area to photograph them. And these are some of the early pictures. And again, you can see a bit of laziness in repairing the roof, and therefore they have to use corrugated metal. But the people are still very healthy. They have a wonderful rice culture, but no more headhunting, except these guys have to still wear the traditional wear to collect money from tourists. Unfortunately, the real tribal ceremonial traditions are only used for tourism. And you can see the beginning of overcrowding in the village. If they leave the original ones spatially, it'll be much healthier. But overpopulation is one of the problems of traditional communities. Now, I want to slip across to Singapore. This was photographed in the 60s in Kallang Basin. And who are these people? So at that time, I was still interested to relate with not only just the built form, but the actual people that came in here to see how they live, what they smelled like in that area. So I visited this Bugis boat, not Bugis, sorry, they're Bawanis from Pebian Island. And so I spent some time with them, photographing them and seeing what they ate and so on in here. And they were traveling from Java. The Bawanis became actually the people connected with racing. Most of the size in turf clubs are Boyanis, but should we say Bawianis or they say Pebian? Now we go to the folk culture. Look at these wonderful boats. You can still see them today. And I'm actually very excited when I go in that area, which I revisit quite often up to a couple of years ago. This is in a place called Tuban, which is north of Surabaya in Java. And that area together, Madura, is so rich in the built form of boats and the fishing culture and people surviving by the economy of the sea. Still pretty healthy, but getting overpopulated. Look at the wonderful boat forms. You can still see this today. Almost worth making travels there. Maybe I should start a travel advisory service and get free trips with whoever wants to go there. This is a traditional house in Madura. It's already slightly bastardized because of the brickwork, but you can see the traditional form, which relates to the joglo of the Javanese. Then, of course, we are used to the Bugis who come to Malaysia, and of course, many of our prominent politicians have a Bugis origin from Makassar. And they come in these boats called pinesi. And I was telling Zaki that it actually came from the European word pines. So it's a sailing boat that has the name pinisi, which is also being built in shipyards. And of course, we should compare with what was built in Terengganu, but nothing as splendid as these boats. So boat building culture is still very much alive, and it is a clue about carpentry work that perhaps should be revived to save the traditional houses. Then I also traveled recently to the middle of the sea between Borneo and Sulawesi to visit an island called Pulau Badi, just to look at a tree actually with very unusual flowers. But lo and behold, look at this beautiful village community, no problem of fish, and they of course import the rice, but a wonderful community, and I think very well worth sociological studies to see how communities can survive, although slightly overpopulated, or maybe too overpopulated. They're using solar cells and water from wells, but so the balance of water supply is an indication of capacity. This is a typical shop, which you very much like what we have in our kampongs in the old days. Very clean. This is actually not the island. This is the main island I went to look at the tree, but there's an equivalent one. Now I'm going to show you what it looks like. Look at it. This is a Google thing. How do you have a community self-sufficiency, and they also have the solar farm there. I visited and I did stay there, but I stayed on another island whilst cruising around here. Look at it. And of course, because it's a very unified Muslim population, the mosque plays a very central role, almost like within a medieval castle. And yet with enough green, but they still have to have a dependency on the urban connection with Makassar, which is about 2 hours away by boat. Look at, is it overpopulated? I think it is getting a bit too much. But in the days when if we had about 2/3 of this population, I think they can be self-sustaining. Then you must know this, the Toraja of central Sulawesi. These were early pictures, which I repeated recently. The carvings, the motifs, why they do this, it's still kind of symbolic. This actually is a rice barn. And some of these things are done almost as symbolic things for health and keeping away spirits. The motif of the buffalo, we will see there. Now, I put this in because this is an impact of modernization. In the same village where you have the Toraja buildings, I thought it's a nice photograph anyway, with the reflection. And it looks quite healthy, despite the not very good construction. And what's wonderful about it is the water clean and unpolluted. So you've got to think about wastewater. If it can be clean, not smelly, then life is still nice. The folk art, it's actually like pop art. Then another test. Actually, I gave a lecture in UPM years ago, and I showed this picture, which I wonder how many in the audience can give an answer. Please tell me later how many of you could identify this. It is a wonderful island, a sultanate by itself, almost like a kingdom. In the island called Ternate in North Maluku, next to the other island called Tidore, which both of them are smoking volcanoes. So they have to pray a lot to make sure the volcano doesn't erupt in the wrong way. And next to it is a wonderful island called Halmahera. As I said, it's a sultanate, it's a kingdom by itself, and they actually have a very good university there, which is actually contributing to, I'm sure, learning in Indonesia. The Indonesian researchers are really quite wonderful in awareness of their own cultures. Now we go to the area which I'm very interested in, the island of Flores at the top, and the island of Sumba on the left. The island of Timor on the right, I never got to, but I covered Flores and Sumba quite a lot, and I'm going to show you pictures of their traditional buildings. The one at the top, top left, is where the Komodo Island, the Komodo dragons were, and I went there 3 years ago to see them in the neighboring island of Rinca. The port there is called Labuhan Bajo, from which we used to drive around. I used to make sure that I travel overland and saw a lot of Flores, which I first visited in the 70s, traveling from east to west, from Maumere to Ende, but I only got halfway. And the folk cultures are very interesting there, but I'll show you pictures later. Then the other island of Sumba on the bottom, again, I first visited on the east side in 1982, and then 3 years ago, I recovered it from the west and then from the east again. Well worth making travel trips for students and so on if you can get grants to travel around, and I'd be very happy to advise how to do this. Of course, you get to bring me along and pay for my expenses. Now, in Flores, we go back to archaeology. This is a cave earlier than Nia in Sarawak. The anthropologists are still studying, archaeologists are still studying this cave to go back how far it is. Is it earlier than the Java man? And it is a cave called Liangbao. And very well, the museum there had a lot of information. And in Indonesia, when you go to these places, I think we need to compare this with what's happening in Kedah. So a lot to learn, and I think a lot of anthropologists are still researching there. They haven't got all the clues yet. Now, the other traditional villages are also well informed, and they take care of tourists. You have to sign in, pay a fee. Today, I suppose you have to check in for COVID. And then when I traveled in Flores, we went to the central part near the town of Ruteng for this called the spider web, the famous spider web rice fields. And how the traditional families divided the rice field in this way is an interesting part of tradition where they converge. Here is on the western side of Flores, the group of the villages called Manggarai, which I never saw earlier but only visited recently. They still keep this traditional village near Waikabuba. And look at it, of course, modernization, almost everyone has got the disc. But people are still living there, but they have avoided overpopulation because the next village is formed around and they're still able to keep their old village. Look at this wonderful one near Ruteng. This is actually highly shown in tourist pictures and very well kept, well worth visiting. And again, conserved by not interspacing with new buildings, but the new village is next door. This was what I nearly visited coming from the east. This group of the native groups called Ngada. And they're symbolic. The shrines in front, either male or female, they have a sex distinction there. And you see the construction. And they're still keeping well into their weaving tradition, ikat, wonderful, and that's one of their means of economy. This is Sumba. And another village, very well kept. The stone things in the middle, in the old days, I went to a village called Anak Alam. And in actual fact, they are actually tombs of ancestors. There was a tradition, only in some groups keep the dead bodies in caves. But these days, they actually have the ancestors in the tomb right in the middle of their village. And at one time, which is something which they've forgotten, they used to cut off heads there. So I heard this secondhand. I'm not really an anthropologist, but particularly the Toba Batak have a very interesting tradition. If you accuse somebody of a serious crime, he will be put to death by having his head chopped off. But the accuser has to do the cutting off of the head. So if you're very queasy, you don't accuse anybody. But you can see they're still very healthy living in there. And of course, the wealth is expressed by the buffalo horns that each family was able to possess and sacrifice. And of course, there is a relationship with Minangkabau. And this is one of the villages in near Tamboloka. Of course, this is still much preserved for tourism, but people are still living there and they avoid the overpopulation by having subsidies and encouraging them to keep there and sell their folk craft. But the landscape of Sumba is actually very interesting. And you can see that the settlements are only in the rivers, which has got enough water throughout the year. The rest is like a desert. And here's one such village at the top of the hill. So the water has to be carried from the bottom. So they get very good exercise, especially for the women to go down and collect the water and bring them up. In the other village, which we visited in 82, and I did recently, called Malolo, which was a royal town. And when I went in 83, they were having a royal funeral. These things are also the tombs of the leaders. There's a symbolic, somewhat like a horse. This is also horse culture there. Ikat. So I still about have 30 minutes, is it, or 25? Now, you know where we are, back home to Sarawak. How many longhouses are there left like this? And can you identify which tribe? How many people in Sarawak, in the urban areas, know the difference between the tribal groups? Just as how many people in Peninsula know how many Orang Asli tribes there are. So if you do not know your own culture, how can you start thinking about the rest of the world? These were pictures I took in the 60s, and many of which are no longer like this, but however, we have a lot of images. And this was taken during one of the weddings I attended up the Baram River. And then they had the Baram Regatta, and once a year. And of course, the height of fashion. Now, do you want to return to this tradition? How many ladies still have these ear style and these wonderful pendant? I'm not quite sure why they did this, but somebody should explain. Maybe it helps the women listen better. Now, in those days, he's taken in 1960 of the Penang, the wandering tribes near the Mulu cave. And they had their pet hornbill, which was very interested. I wanted to steal it from them, but I didn't think it was a good idea. You can see from their faces that this group of Penang has ethnic relationship with the what we call the Tibeto-Burman tribes of northern Assam, the Nagaland. If you can compare, and maybe even the DNA will show us the connection. So how people wandered and formed tribes in Southeast Asia is part of the exciting history. Now we go back to our own. I talk about the Orang Asli and how many tribes are there. And I hope UPM students who are also working with the Samai should be the experts on this. And we also look forward to sharing some of our experiences with the Tamia group. And my key Tamia guy is in there, two of them on the right-hand side. You can see it a bit bigger with better nutrition. The one in the middle is the chief of the Jahai troop in the Sungai Tiang village. He got very good memory because when I went back later, he said, why didn't I bring him what I promised the earlier trip? And this is what they lived, the women there. And look at how beautiful the village is. Wouldn't you like to live there, as against in Damansara? But this is what's happening to the villages. This is in the Plus area, Sungai Pia in Perak. And I really work mainly with the Tamia, which is all part of my botanical team. So these houses were subsidized by government, contractors, but it's helping them to lose their tradition of building. Another form of cultural erosion. The index we devised has to do with the capability of repeating their original carvings and everything else, which I will show you examples where this is still conserved, and we also look at examples where it's lost. So look at that village, they cannot even maintain the houses given to them. They still have their favorite food, which is the wild boar, which they differentiate from the pig, so they call it ta'ong. It's still eaten by them, although some of them are Muslims. You can see the modernization and somewhat lost futures. And of course, they're quite practical. They wear whatever they can given to them. T-shirts and so on are fine. And the climate shows that they can still withstand the thing. They're quite resistant to disease. And I hope COVID. But you see, for example, malaria is one of the problems there. But most of them are quite resistant. Those who are not have died, like COVID. I tried to revive something. And here one day I said, hey, do you know how to wear the loincloth, the chawat? They said, no, we don't use anymore. So I bought a bale and got these kids to wear them. The big ones refused to wear. In fact, most of them will wear it if you pay them, like big tourist objects. So we got the kids to learn how to tie the chawat, which is quite practical. But after I went away, all the women stole them and turned them into their own cloth. So they never wore chawat after that. So we cannot artificially try to bring them back. They have to have it of their own volition. But this is still what government is helping them build. And surely UPM students can do better. But look at the tradition. They can still build this. And this is a tradition. We should encourage them to rebuild and see what we can do with sensible modernization. But they are nomadic. This beautiful village is no longer there because they move every few years. But as they start to work in town or in rubber estates or oil palm estates, they neglect, and the carpenters are no longer there. And that is the key thing in cultural erosion. You've got to honor the carpenters and the builders. But in the traditional village, almost anybody can build. Just as we tried in my botanic garden in Penang, we rebuilt this little village, Temia village, also to learn how they do it. And they use the roof. The roofing material is from a palm leaf or from the Bertam palm, not the Nipa, not the Rumbia. And the Temia called it Beltok. This is the village in our botanic garden. Unfortunately, it hasn't lasted because we only expect a 5-year life, but hopefully we will rebuild it to get them involved again. This is the location in our botanic garden, so we can actually redo this little village, but also look at other parts of the agroeconomy. This was one we built some years ago as a visitor area. You can see the woven thing, very much like the woven walls in East Coast. And a bit artificial, we actually tried to get them to expose their dance called the Sewang with their traditional thing. When I look back, I'm sorry I did this. It's really incongruous. We should try to encourage traditional cultures in their original position, not just to titillate visitors and tourists, but they were our staff, so they enjoyed it anyway at that time. Now, going back to what I did when I lectured in architecture, when we set up the school in Singapore in 1958, I brought the first batch of students, which include many distinguished famous architects in Singapore, like Tay Keng Soon, who actually drew one of these drawings. We went around Malacca, and so later, when I published this journal, which was 1961, we actually used this wonderful house in Malacca. This was actually drawn by Tay Keng Soon, so he tells me. I wonder if you can draw like that anyway now. This is a wonderful house, one of the best of its type in Ujung Pasir, which Zaki may remember the place. But as you can see, it deteriorated, and now I'm sure it's gone, probably a housing estate there. So why did owners not conserve it? Why did anybody not encourage them to maintain the form of the house, which is completely livable? Now we come to Penang. This is a house which actually relates to Bugis traditions, with the anjong facing the road and a very rudimentary. In Penang today, we cannot even find houses that represent the best of their type. And we do the survey of the rest of Peninsular Malaysia, we might feel very sad. But you can see that this guy at least kept the tradition. This is actually in Seberang, and built a new one. So that's the villagers' idea of modernization. This is less harmful if they keep the old one. Maybe the elder brother, younger brother, who's gone to town, thinks that that's modernization. But unfortunately, it's pretty crude. So you know which is better. Now, can we rebuild this? In the old days in USM, we have foreign lecturers building the traditional house. So they had a sample house there. But actually later, nobody bothered about it. They were all trying to build houses a la the West. This is a horrible modernization. And this is only taken last week in Balik Palau. So why has the initiative gone? Who cares? Maybe in a multiple family by descent, nobody cares what the grandfather did. That is another picture of it. These were taken a long time ago. You cannot even find a house as good as this in Penang today. This is actually the Kedah type with the double anjong. Then we also had Chinese village houses in Kelantan, in the Kampung China, like the hacienda type, I call them, which you also found in Johor. But I wonder whether any left today. Now we go to what I regard as the best example of surviving civilization, Bali. Rice culture is at the heart of it all. If they lose that, then they all become urban slaves, and the myth of AI survival, which I think should be radically examined. The people who can work the computer but doesn't know how rice is planted, I think should be having to be re-educated. Well, in Bali, you can still have these villages with a traditional decoration. And this was taken many years ago in the 60s, in the 60-year-old, the ceremony that happened only every 60 years in Gunung Agong, the mountain. And this is a funeral, which I photographed, of a very famous chief. in Ubud. And the painters, of course, celebrate the environment. And this is somebody painting a house which I built in Bali. And this was what it was like with a rice field. It was an experiment I had the chance of doing, of course, asking them to build traditionally, placing the three elements together. In a plot of land that was no longer able to have water, they rationed the water, so it no longer could grow rice. So when I did it, I was very careful to park it in a place which wasn't eroding the rice fields. And the rice fields are all around. And this was the view. We had this little rice fields, which I did a bit of an urban dude. I actually planted one crop of rice, and actually I did trash it, but I ate the rice I grew to learn. Of course, I can't do that all the time, and I'm no good at it. But the rice field today is covered with tourist, high-end, high-flying villas owned by foreigners. It's all eroded away. Now, if the authority is seduced into letting this happen, and of course, they try to blame me, but I explain why I chose a site which was really able to keep itself within that environment. But not everybody is as conscious. They want to exploit, and you have just tourism. The whole rice field is gone. This is the house from the top on the right-hand side. And beside it, we did an interesting thing with my late friend Bucky Fuller. I constructed this geodesic dome with him, where we had the meetings in the valley. The stones are still there, but we did the first, this was the Tensegrity bamboo dome, and you see Bucky and I climbing up there. It's quite a historic event, which I'm writing about. And this was the ceremony when we finished building it. You can see how tradition is maintained. Of course, today, a lot of people just buy it from the market, but a traditional family must have women folk that can make fresh ones every morning and put it as a devotive offering to the environment and to the gods. And this was actually my last shot, so I'm very good on timing. So this was just sent to me a few days ago in November. You can see they can still do that. You know, they can still make these things, and you actually have to work at your folk culture. You don't just let a few specialist experts do it. Every family has to be involved in the living traditions, and every village, the Banja system, is a wonderful sense of community. I have one. Shall I carry on for a few minutes since I have time?
Yes, please.
Okay. I should catch my breath so far. Now we talk about what we have to be seriously concerned, not only keeping pretty pictures, but we have to be concerned about the ethnographic research in a serious way, not to just get motifs to use in your decoration. Cultural erosion index. I began to define that, but I think we can hold a separate seminar on how we define it, and we can work on it to give the cultural index for Malaysia. Go to every area and ask why it's gone. And you can see that you no longer have carpenters who can build the same way. The tradition is gone. But we can start off with the Orang Asli, the Semai, the Temia, who still have able people to build traditionally, and see how we can move from there. So local architects and planners are learning everything about the rest of the world, forgetting their own background and their own traditions. And can they really design living environments that represent the true culture of communities that are self-sufficient in their ethos, meaning their culture, and their life essentials endogenously? This is what I want to stimulate. Endogenous means is actually instigated and propelled from local initiatives, not borrowed. So we're building a better world for whom? By whom? The two quotations I put about humans in the universe is actually based on the inspiration of Bucky Fuller, who did a book which I helped publish with him on synergetics, and he allowed me to paraphrase it. And this is an inspiration if you want to get back to the basics, which might go away from selfishness and greed to synergetics and sufficiency, and think of the world for you and me, and not you or me. I think that's my last slide, so maybe we'll have time for interaction. Can I stop here?
Yes, thank you, Datuk Sri,
Thanks.
for the very insightful talk just now. Okay, there are a few questions and comments coming in. I shall read it out, but before we proceed, I would like to give a chance to the audience here because I see that some are your friends, maybe your students. You would like to say hi to Datuk Sri. I can see Prof. Robert Powell, and I think your good friend Mariam and Datin Dr. Nur Hayati as well.
Yeah, I saw her name. Yeah.
Okay, so she's yeah, they're waving. All right. Okay. I will go through. Do you guys have anything from here? If you want to go live to ask questions, you can just state your name and ask the question, or do you want me to read the question from the chat, guys? Can be both ways. If you have any, none.
Can I just say hi to Datuk Sri first?
Hi,
Yes.
Yati. When are you going to do your book? I have to do a crit with you on your thesis.
Okay. Right. I will plan
It's
to
so
go
big.
with
It's so
Dr.
big.
Wan.
I mean, look at the pictures. She did a thesis on the history of my firm, Malayan Architects Co-Partnership. I think it was very brave of you to do that, but I'm here to help you run through it again. So do find time to meet together.
Yeah.
You were very helpful when we worked on the Seremban Mosque, you know, the model that we sent to the Amplas Museum.
Yes.
They just opened recently, and I think they showed those models in the wonderful museum in Hong Kong.
I see.
Yeah, who's that? Oh, there are questions, is it?
Okay. Any questions from the audience? No? If not, then I shall read a few that are comments. Okay.
Maybe before, can I ask that one question?
Okay.
Sure.
Yeah.
Dr. Zaki.
Okay, Dato', one thing that I think is important here is that the kind of work you did back then is not happening today. I mean, how would you suggest the best way for us to keep recording, even during the phase that the term erosion time? Even the erosion is worth noting as it happens to identify the why and how things should go actually. So what would be the best way for us to keep on doing recording and documenting the culture today?
I think you need to build and educate a peer group. You cannot do popular education because not all the students have the capacity to do that. But I think we should really look at the architectural schools and find the vanguard people who can be comprehensivists, looking at the whole cultural background, history, and also start rethinking architecture and when planning. One of the things I would recommend, and I think we actually talked about holding a postgraduate kind of program, maybe like a summer school. You have to, before you know what's good, you actually have to reject what's bad. So go around looking at the horrible things being built today. Bad planning, bad design, lack of consideration in many, many respects. Then you would find the small examples to build from. So we really look to the educational institutions, which are probably overloaded with the wrong students. I have to mention here that when I set up the school in Singapore, I had the liberty then because they weren't very worried about whether too many people coming in or enough people paying fees. But I managed to persuade almost half the class to stop doing the architecture course and move away. So when you cream the best students, you can get better results. But almost all the professions are overloaded with not necessarily the best people. We have to be critical here, but I shouldn't be the one to do this. I think the practicing people should re-examine the situation, and the teachers should look at the quality of education. So I think you are making a really good start in showing this interest. So research, we start off with research techniques and learn very systematically about the tradition and be inspired, not to copy them.
Yeah.
I can't read the questions; they're a bit too
It's
small.
okay.
So
I will read
you
it
have
for
to read
you.
them. Yeah.
I can say it.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
Yvonne, please
Yeah.
proceed. Hi.
Hello, Dr. Wan.
Hello.
Hello, Dr. Lim. So thank you for the presentation, Dr. Lim, and UPM, Dr. Wan and Dr. Zaki for organizing this great and rare event. So my name is Yvonne. I just graduated from the AA, and I totally agree that we should pick up, understand, and document our own cultures first before we learn the Western canons as opposed to what we are conventionally taught in architecture schools. So I have two questions, actually a very long question. So I really like vernacular architecture as well. Preserving all this knowledge is important, but in reality, we are not going to live in thatched roofs. And there are attempts in Malaysian or Singaporean architecture to replicate the core principles, mainly like solar shading and ventilation from vernacular architecture to implement it in contemporary forms. But mostly they are limited to institutional buildings, I noticed, and not in mass housing, where most of the vernacular architecture are mostly housing typologies. So my question is it possible to implement the lessons learned from vernacular architecture for housing in urban areas, such as high-rise housing, or perhaps should we abandon the urban and actually return to the rural again, which actually could lead to another problem, which is the suburban sprawls that is harmful to the environment? So yeah, if you can answer that now, I'll just ask the second question later.
Oh, it's very easy. Organize another symposium and let's talk for 3 hours on that subject. But I gave you a hint because you may not know that I was actually on one of the preparatory committees for the Stockholm Conference in 1970, and with the subject was the impact of urbanization on man's environment. Undoubtedly, the urban areas are overpopulated. We must have a spectrum from nice villages, small towns, to the big cities. But you cram everything into primate cities, things start going wrong.
Yeah.
I disagree with you slightly, but I need to know what's happening in AA today. I haven't heard anything more about that. I used to lecture to the DPU people and used to know the famous teachers like Bill Allen. Have you heard of him?
Oh, no, not
You
really.
see, you don't even know the history of AA. You should go back to the history of AA in London.
The history of A is like 172 years. So if I want to go back, I have to like read 172
No,
years
but
of
that's why
history.
we study history. I mean, after all, you're looking at an antique character here talking about what's happening in the 60s. But you see, we actually must take in the world at the same time as taking in our own background. You have to do it simultaneously. It's not one against the other. Most of us have to catch up with globalization and distill from that what is meaningful, not just being copyists. But there are many things you could learn because when I learned in the West, we're also learning about tropical architecture and things like solar angles, insulation, and so on. So you have to start off today before we talk about even the villages. Look at how many buildings are wrongly oriented and the elevations are horrible. You talk about the Green Building Index. Most of the buildings, just look around you, all the buildings, how many of them are well oriented? So why is it? Why is it the planners don't stop it? Why is it the architects are putting up such bad buildings? These are fundamentals for a young architect like you to address. But your subject is very good, and we should hold a long seminar about it. The
Yeah,
inspiration
I
of
agree.
looking, as I hinted to you, when you look at village situations, first thing is that go and live in a village. Then you can use temporary materials. But if I build today in a city, I have to use more permanent materials, also largely because you can't afford to build in timber. It's cheaper to build in concrete than in timber because that industry is slanted that way. And of course, many people don't want to build in timber because they're afraid of cutting down trees. However, it's a question of optimization. If you did sustainable logging, you can work within the limit. The problem is overpopulation and overexploitation. You've gone beyond the balances of harmony. But you can see traditions that can be self-sustaining. Like I showed you the island. And have you ever visited Bali?
No, I didn't get a chance.
Oh, well, take me along. If you can pay for my trip, I'll show you Bali. You
When
can
I earn
see,
more money, I will bring you along.
yeah, don't buy
It's a
lotteries.
good one.
Now, have you heard of Banjas and Desas, organization of communities?
No, not yet.
We have lost this in our area because all the communities are gone. They're taken over by political gangs. There's no sense of community in every area. And we won't talk about Malacca. Who are the Malaccans today? And all these guys trying to be politicians, are they not of the community? What do they know about the kampung houses? What do they know about even the traditional houses in the city? You have to go to the basics. So the community organization, have you heard of kibbutzim and moshavs in Israel?
No,
How
not really.
communities are running their own villages. And actually the Balinese have this, they call the Banjar system. So you can see how the community looks at itself as traditions and so on. They live within their means, and of course they are unified in their beliefs, which helps. But once you have modernization, you have to accommodate a cosmoplot, much more difficult. But the idea of muhiba and harmony is something which has to be self-initiated, not according to somebody dictating to you from a political position.
Yeah,
But
that's right. So,
Yeah, I totally agree. Like that's the fallacy of electoral politics. Yeah, maybe I'll just like let the next person move on.
yeah,
Thank
so
you.
you have a second question, Yvonne?
Yeah, I have a second question, but if you want to let me ask the second one.
Okay, perhaps you keep the second question first, and we allow the first person to actually ask a question,
Yeah.
which is
Thank you.
Mr. Sanjay Raman. Okay, he's here. He's open. Do you want to ask the question yourself, or do you want me to read it out, Mr. Sanjay?
yeah, do that. I can't read, they're too small.
Yeah. Mr. Sanjay,
Coming on.
all right. If not, I will read Mr. Sanjay's question if you're not reading. Okay, his question is, what are the persisting challenges or limitations in ethnography study for our region? Examples, stereotypes, assumptions, cultural blind spots. So that's his question, Datuk Sri.
Well, I don't know whether you're in a university, but firstly ask whether your university has an anthropology department or anybody studying ethnography or social systems. But if not, you have to form a group and create a society to do this. You can take the initiative. Of course, there are lots and lots of books, but life's too short to read all of them. But work out a study group, create a study group, and you can learn. So you cannot cover everything because you know what we've been describing is how many half a century of what we've been doing. But you can start off with the area you're interested in and say what are you interested. For example, in Malaysia, we suggested how much you know of the Orang Asli. And then you look at the ones in Sabah, Sarawak. A lot to discover at home. And then go next door. You see wonderful things happening, say in Sumatra and so on. So the initiative is yours. And if you're in a university, ask why the universities don't even teach you basics like geography, if not history. You have to start off by self-interest. You know, don't say I didn't attend a course because everything can be learned. And of course, the internet has a lot of information, both good and bad, sometimes false. So you have to be discriminating. But of course, the luck is that you find the right mentors to induct you. Form a group. Form a group if you want to learn, and be specific. What do you want to learn about? And identify it, and find people to encourage you. Well, you didn't tell me who you are and where you're from. But
Yeah, I'm not sure, but you can see Mr. Sanjay on the screen, but he's muted.
yeah.
Yeah. If you want to say something and introduce yourself, that would be great, Mr. Sanjay.
Yeah, I couldn't see his face. So.
Oh,
The challenges. Firstly, the other sad thing is that our museums are actually not doing their job in educating. They're already a bit stereotyped. They're not enough educational programs. Okay, who's next?
all right. Sorry, just to inform you,
Robert,
Mr. Sanjay is from USM, School of Housing, Building and Planning. Okay. Wow.
I think Robert unmute himself. Maybe Robert wants to.
Okay. Prof. Robert, Prof. Powell, are you about to ask something?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, very clearly.
I'm
Yes.
still here, yeah. I haven't got a question, that I just enjoyed your talk. It brought back many memories. I first came to Southeast Asia in 1979 and went to Sulawesi via Ujung Pandang, and you brought back memories of the Bugis boats in Ujung Pandang and the tribal people up in on the coast near Morowali. So it's been a lovely lecture, and I thank you very much for that. And I'm pleased that I was able to attend. Thank you.
Thank
Well,
you.
I'm so glad you withstood it, because I had to gabble and rattle along and use the inspiration of the moment. But it's a serious area that I'm actually glad to time travel back. And the serious thing is that UPM's interest leads us to firstly into documentation, but arising from that, the inspirations of what we can learn will emerge. So we firstly do systematic documentation, but you've got to get the students to know history and geography, and also cultures. What each of the group, like you start in Malaysia, you know the difference between the Temia and the Semai and the Jahai and the Jahut, etc., etc. Ever heard of the Menrik? There are only 40 or 200 of them left. Discover at home. You don't have to go elsewhere. But also for the serious architects, that young lady from AA, start by looking at the horrible buildings in the cities. And if you're part of university, you can be critical about it. Of course, if practicing architect, it may be unethical to comment. But I think students and lecturers can do it in a very objective way. Start looking at the badly oriented buildings, the bad use of materials, bad use of decoration. There's pollution, the visual pollution.
Yeah. Okay, Dato. There's a question from the chat and a few more questions from the FB Live. I'm gonna take you one at a time. Okay, one question from Adham. He's doing his Masters of Architecture in UPM. His question is, you mentioned about sense of community. What is your concern when you start designing buildings for them? What are your considerations?
We are now going into the field of planning, and I actually have not had the opportunity of doing something in this country because the communities are breaking up. But I think I know what to do if I were to ask to design a real community, like a new neighborhood. See, when I did the house in Bali, I was actually relating to that whole banja called Penastanan, and there were two banjas there. And I related with them, I helped them, and they were I became part of the community. That's one example. I think you have to be specific. If you want to tackle as a student, find an example and let's do a planning study. What can be done? Essentially, the question of density and what that community, are you just a dormitory for people to live in and going to work, like these housing for foreign workers? You have to create, you see, you're going back actually with a lot of inspiration from even Corbusier. You know, you have to be comprehensive in your systems, living, working, playing, all in the same community. In the old days, we also planned neighborhoods, and the new towns in Britain have all these examples. And even the early days of the housing board in Singapore, they were trying to create neighborhoods. Today is, of course, rather overpopulated, but they're still doing the best they can in that kind of social engineering. But I think we should try smaller communities. Most of the work is done by housing developers, some doing quite good work, but essentially to sell, and worse, using images, buildings which are completely derivative, Mediterranean style, or they want to be a la something or other. So maybe a developer should try creating something that is really relating to our situation.
Yeah. Okay, Dato, thank you. I hope that answer would satisfy Adham and he can expand more on his thesis. Okay, going back to Yvonne, she actually has a second question for you, Dato Sri. So, Yvonne, you're on.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Wan. So my second question is, like you said earlier, even though like the internet has enabled research to be done far easier than before, and many valuable documentations and photos and even artifacts are kept in the West, which I believe many has not been digitized yet. And in recent years, there are a lot of conversations around decolonization, and one of them includes the issue of repatriation. returning all these artifacts or knowledge back to the origin countries and acknowledging the uncomfortable histories tied to colonial violence. So what do you think about this issue?
I think it's going beyond the scope of what we're doing. I don't think you have to blame anybody. It's for you to discover what is available, but actually we are getting less and less developed. I'm afraid the deterioration in this country in cultural areas. So, for example, in botanic gardens, in museums and so on, we don't even have a natural history museum after many, many years. I was the chairman of FRIM, so I know what could be done in that area. And then also the Academy of Sciences appear to be helpless in getting a national museum. But it takes a lot of effort to create anything. So when you're young like you, why don't you start one and pick what is available? Now, how long were you in AA?
Just 2
How
years.
long did you live in London?
I did my part 2 at AA. I did my part 1 at Taylor's locally.
Oh, you were from Taylor's. Okay.
Yeah.
So you went to AA for 2 years.
2 years, yeah.
2 years. Were you in London? Did you live in London?
Yeah, I was in London for around 6 months, and then I came back because of the pandemic.
Oh, you're just newly returned, huh?
Yeah, I just knew it. Yeah.
Right. You don't look infected anyway. But the thing is this, when you're in London, what did you learn? Have you been to the Natural History Museum?
Yeah, I went to the museum almost like every day if I could to like absorb
Museum
as
of
much as
Mankind?
possible. Yeah.
Museum of Mankind?
Mankind, no. I went to the Natural History Museum and the British Museum almost every day because it's like nearby.
Oh, great. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think you have to be a recruit in this research program. Did you visit any curators? Have you met any curators? Have
No,
you met any of the people researching on Malaysian history in London?
I didn't
Like,
manage to like talk to the curators. So, and I was there for like 6 months only.
Yeah, but it's good if you pick it up and try to contact the people working on Malaysian history. In my days, people like John Bastin, you know, there's Mary Gallup, all these people are there. And there are a lot of people researching in this part of the world. That's why when I mentioned at MIT, I worked with people who were studying the region. But at the same time, then find who else at home is interested in the subject. Have you found anybody in Malaysia?
Not yet, but right now I'm also like kind of building my contacts as well, like Dr. Wan, and then like expanding my network in Malaysia.
Okay, good luck. Tell me when you get somewhere.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yvonne. Okay, there are a few more questions from the FB Live. One is coming from Dr. Siti Salmiah Awang. Her question is there any special architectural practice among the natives in Indonesia to withstand disaster events, especially in areas exposed to the current climate change and disastrous events like tsunami and earthquake? Sorry, it's Colonel Dr. Siti Salmiah. She's with Ministry of Defense.
I have actually lost track with them, but there were dedicated groups in Bandung in ITB, and there was a group working. Definitely, there were groups working on Aceh, and recently there was a group working on Sulawesi. I actually wanted to contact them, but I had other things to do. I'm more interested in the plants. And I'm sure there are very many dedicated people. I would like to get to meet them. And maybe if any signal from here to them, we should really welcome them to contact us. But I definitely heard of this group who are studying particularly Sulawesi and particularly the place called Palu, which I happen to know very well. In fact, I was there 1 month before the tsunami, and all the places I stayed in were wiped out. So I'm glad I was no longer there 1 month later. So, and that is an area which I could actually give some views about the recovery and the rebuilding. But I'm sure there are a lot of people doing that, and we only got to know them. Personally, I don't, but I would love to meet them. So maybe through the ASEAN context, we should do that, because undoubtedly we could exchange a lot. But in terms of the earlier research, we had a lot of contacts, as I mentioned, Chandra Mualim in ITB, Robi Sulato, and many, many other people. I think Indonesia has a very vibrant professional group, and also many not just interested in lucrative practices.
Yeah, true. That's true. Okay, next, moving on to next question. This is from Dr. Sarah Sueb, consultant and founder of Hint Studio in Brussels. I think we can see Dr. Sarah there. I think she's inside the car. Is that you, Dr. Sarah? You can unmute if you want to speak.
Has he got his face there?
Yeah, she has her face there, but that's okay. I think I will read it from for her.
Brussels. Did you say she's from Brussels?
Yep, she's from Brussels. Okay, thank you for super interesting lecture. Coming from industrial design field, I realized the value of anthropological knowledge in the design process only after my MSc, her master's. It would be really interesting to look at your collection for design objects within our region. Now, do you have any knowledge about the design of the roof traditional houses shown in the presentation and how these forms come into being?
Well, I think I did show you the measured drawings done by people. And as I say, one of the key thing in cultural erosion is to find the people can rebuild those houses again, like in Bali and the Orang Asli, and I dare say in many parts of Indonesia. But in Malaysia, even the traditional Malay houses, it'd be hard put to find the craftsmen. And already many years ago, we realized that the few remaining ones were all called to do motifs in hotel ballrooms. You know, like the carvings of Sobek and so on. They're only available to do it for the commercial buildings, so that even for local buildings, they can't afford to do it. But the West, if you're in Brussels, you see the Western museums have so much material. And for example, the Leiden Museum for Folk Culture has got wonderful collections. So you want to look for motifs. I'm sure the European museums have much more collections than we have in our own museums here. It's what the other lady talked about, repatriation. You don't need to. A lot of them are shared by images. You can get virtual information, tours of those museums. But you have to go and hunt for them. But the design field is so wide, so it depends on which area you're looking at, whether you're looking at industrial design. And then you prompt me to actually mention the name, the Bauhaus, which I had a good contact with Walter Gropius himself. And I might say here is one clue, because many of the precepts of the Bauhaus Revolution have been forgotten by commercialists who overexploit. They no longer go to the basic concepts of form and function. They only want decoration. So if we go to basics, we should simplify. Many of the things happening in architecture, even in bamboo architecture like the Green School, they overdo it. They're trying to do wonderful arabesques, but when you go to the basic construction, that is more fundamental. So we shouldn't overdo, and there are a lot of horrible buildings which are overdone around in the world, and I don't want to mention names here, but under protection, I might do so on a separate occasion.
Okay,
A
we're
lot of
still going
fancy
on live.
buildings.
We're still going on live now.
Extravagant buildings. In fact, I can mention one because I was only looking up. Look at the Louis Vuitton Museum in Paris, done by Frank Gehry. Is that a hero or a villain in architectural history? I ask a question, you answer. Have you seen that museum? It's an amazing exercise in extravagance and incomprehensibility. That's a very good one for architecture students to analyze today, apart from how it was built for a budget of 800 million euro, which is still being investigated how it was financed. But unfortunately, students look at copybooks and they say, I want to design things like that too. They're senseless. So let's be sensible in our architecture.
Yeah, okay. All right, just on the term of cultural erosion, how relevant is it now that a lot of the times we've been told to move towards IR 4.0, Industrial Revolution 4.0. So at times it can be contradicting in certain situations. So what do you see? What's your opinion on that, Dr. Sri?
You're absolutely right. It's a contradiction. I think you've forgotten about the idea of self-sufficiency. If you're too dependent on imports and so on, you're part of an international racket. you have to aim for self-sufficiency. That's why even when you build, I felt this very early stages when we were building, even buildings at the conference hall. I did not want to be seduced by using huge pieces of glass which you have to import. So if you're seduced by the fashion of materials and so on, and you forget the basics. So one of our challenges is how to make timber affordable today. Of course, there are sort of composites and so on, you know, but don't think the solution is by importation of ideas. You have to go back to basics.
Yeah, true. Okay, I shall open to last questions if there are any. Time is now 6:32. If there are any questions you would like to ask, take this opportunity to grab hold of Datuk Sri. You are more than welcome.
Virtually.
Virtually.
Yes,
Don't worry, Dr. No, we will go and visit him, you and me.
We really have to work on the collection because they are,
Yeah.
as I say, you have to curate over 100,000 images. Your people have copied a few, but we still have a lot more.
Yeah. Well,
Dr. Wan, if I may add,
yes, please.
I'm not an architect by profession, but Datuk Sri is a very dear friend, and yeah, I must say this to the faculty and the university that you are very fortunate that he's willing to share whatever that he has with him, because he has got a treasure trove that is worth. I would say it's priceless. You can't name a price for whatever that Datuk Sri has. And I congratulate you on the fact that he wants to work with you. And I mean that you both want to work together. And then I wish you all the best. Because I know for a fact that I've been to his house where, well, as I've said, as I've mentioned to him, his home is a congregation of so many different races. We've got Indians, we've got the Aslis, we've got the Saraukian upstairs, the Malays, and the Chinese coming in and out, everybody, the members of his staff. I mean, he is a true Malaysian.
I'm a globalist.
I've never met another such as he. So that is what I need to say. And yeah, congratulations for this opportunity.
Thank you, Mariam. You look wonderful with that wonderful background.
No, I'm in Langkawi, and that's the first.
Really?
Sorting out some things and some work.
You have to come this way.
Yeah, I will in time.
Mariam is a lawyer who's lecturing in UTM. No, Mara, yeah. Now, anyway, wonderful background you have over there. Is it a picture or the actual?
No. It's my daughter's lab. I'm helping her to move from her home and sorting things out from here. Yeah, lots of things.
Do come and help us sort more stuff out here.
I will in time. In time. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Okay. I think Architect Sophie would like to ask a question to Datuk Sri. Architect Sophie, floor is yours.
Hi. Salam, Datuk Sri. We met last time in Penang with Datuk Hajida visiting your precious garden with the whole collection of it. My question to you today is regarding the state of timber industry or development or research in Malaysia. What's your view in this? Whether where are we in exploring the full potential of new timber development, in the sense like not just raw timber log, but looking at glulam, the CLT, the new form of timber. What's your position on that? Do you consider that, that the processed timber consume more embodied energy, or should it be used, timber be used in a natural form rather than a processed form?
Thanks for your very important questions. I wish I were younger to join in the fun of finding the solutions. But seriously, something should be done to improve the work of the main agencies like the Timber Board and even MARA and all those organizations concerned with native materials. I think a lot more work could be done. Even RRI, all those institutions had their great days, and a lot can be done, even the use of bamboo, that kind of thing. So, but you got to get the right people into these agencies because they are declining because they seem to have lost the best people. And I'm sure they're struggling in manpower. I think the resource, we should be confident that if you put the right people in charge, we can really get better results. For example, the use of rubber wood, of course, plywood. However, the other thing that you have to have the discipline is to stop being seduced by imported material. Force yourself to use more indigenous material. Simplify your buildings. That's the way to go. You're part of ECOMOS, right? The group that came with Hajida.
Yeah.
And so, as you know, you have to start by knowing your trees and your plants. And again, people have forgotten even the name of trees. So, funny enough, when I was a student, I made it my point to know what the precursor Frim did. And I used to learn the name of timbers. So how many timber species do the current architects know? Have you heard of Masawa, Keruing, the name of timbers? Ramin, even today, you can't get Ramin. Balau.
Yeah, apparently it's all the timber that we use is only like a very small percentage to what actually we have in Malaysia.
But the point is that you even forgotten what those timbers stand for, and you forgot the shrinkage aspects, you know, the triaxial shrinkage and all that. So when you go to building materials, you know, in Britain they had the Building Research Center. Do we have one now? So that's you go back to basic materials and simplify buildings. Then you can use more indigenous material. But unfortunately, being swamped by imported stuff, the commercialization of everything imported. The worst area is in food. They've forgotten to eat local. So sure, I hope your group will stimulate something. Look at what is the research of the Timber Board doing? I mean, we have to be very frank, and I'm sure there are good people there, but I think they're under-supported and under-encouraged. So we're only interested in exporting. The development of local usage is not there. And even the training of technicians, training of carpenters. Which school is training a good carpenter today? Can they make the joints? Can make the joints even in the timber house, the old timber house? And maybe e-commerce should do, like I used the picture of the house in Ujung Pasir. Let's rebuild that. Then you know what it takes. And then if you can do it simply, I suggested we can do something with the Tamiya people. They will know how to build traditionally. And they can still get it from the forest. But any use of material has an optimum point. You mustn't overdo it. But once you do it purely for export, you finish your forest. But if you use it for local usage, you can do a lot with what you have. In fact, timber has to be cut, but it has to be cut reasonably. Trees overgrow. People don't cut a tree. Trees fall down, they get overgrown. So sustainable logging, all these have been understood, but the practice, there's still people exploiting, cutting it down to sending it out overseas. Export is part of the problem. Let's be more self-sufficient.
I have to agree on that note, Datuk Sri, because yesterday, just recently, we went to visit our own faculty of forestry and environment in UPM itself. And the information that we do export our timber, like Sabah and Sarawak, it's like a lot. I mean, 100% is being exported. And this is one of the issues that is happening even in the peninsula of Malaysia. They try to extract all the timber resources from our jungle out there and export. And it is funny, it is sad to see that even our own where we plant the things in our own on our own land, it's expensive for us to even use it. So it's something that is wrong somewhere along the line there.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier, your first thing is to even know your local timbers.
Yeah.
So we can do, like we're studying traditional, like look at our traditional timbers. What is a julotong? What does it look like? The feel of the wood and so on. You see, unfortunately, the big business has turned into monoculture. not in oil palm, but in rubber. And at one time, I saw so much oil palm in Sabah that I thought the state name should be changed to Sawit. Then you have all the thing cutting down what they're growing acacia mengia, which is an Australian tree. And they're growing acacia mengia all over the place, rotting even in Belum. So forestry got swamped by commercialization for export. But frankly, when they grew, they don't even know how to cut and use. There can be a serious reform, and if people are prepared to look at the timber supply in our own country, and of course, rubber wood is one area to be worked on.
True. Okay, there are no more questions, and I think we should wrap it up. It's near 7:15 now. All right, if there are no questions, okay. So I would like to thank all participants for attending this lecture, be it live in Webex or in Facebook. And most importantly, I would like to sincerely thank Datuk Sri for the great knowledge sharing with our students and other participants to inspire them to become not just better architects, but actually better persons. Okay, after all, being a professional, one needs to see with the eyes of another, listen with the ear of another, and feeling with the heart of another. One of Datuk Sri's quotes that I managed to pick up is, to cater for nation building, one needs to learn from the world, but not copy. So with that, I end today's session with Assalamualaikum and have a great weekend, you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.